first thing she noticed was the voice. Low, distorted, forced deeper than normal, like someone trying too hard to sound dangerous. The man standing in the doorway wore black from head to toe, gloves, mask, gun. It was just after midnight on New Year's Day. Outside, fireworks had barely stopped echoing across the quiet Georgian neighborhood. Families were celebrating. Couples were kissing. Children were asleep. And inside one dark bedroom, a woman was about to come face to face with a man who had spent years destroying her life behind closed doors. He beat her, tried to strangle her, bound her wrists with zip ties that had already been prepared in advance. Then he dragged her outside barefoot into the freezing January air, pulled a pillowcase over her head, and whispered something that would haunt investigators later. "You're going to miss your husband." At first, she thought it was just another threat. But then he lifted her off the bed, and suddenly she knew exactly who he was. Not from his face, not from his voice, but from the way he carried her. Because once upon a time, that same man had carried her gently when she was pregnant with their twins. And in that horrifying moment, tied up on her own back porch, Morgan Metser realized something terrifying. The masked intruder wasn't a stranger. It was her ex-husband, and in less than an hour, he would return pretending to save her. Before there was fear, before there were police reports, bruises, courtroom statements, and a freezing back porch in the middle of the night, there was a teenage girl who believed she had found the kind of love people spend their whole lives searching for, or at least something that looked exactly like it. Morgan Metser was only 14 years old when she met Rodney Metser. At that age, life still feels enormous and undefined. Every emotion feels bigger than it really is. Every heartbreak feels permanent. Every romance feels destined. Rodney was 17, older, more confident, the kind of boy who already seemed certain of himself, while Morgan was still learning who she was. And from the very beginning, Rodney focused his attention on her with an intensity that felt impossible to ignore. He remembered little things. The music she liked, her favorite snacks, the stories she told casually and forgot 5 minutes later. Morgan would mention wanting something once, and Rodney would somehow find a way to get it. If she had a bad day, he became determined to make her smile again. If she felt insecure, he reassured her endlessly. To Morgan, it didn't feel manipulative. It felt safe, like finally being fully seen by someone. Teenage girls are often taught to dream about this kind of love. The boy who chooses you above everyone else. The boy who texts constantly because he can't stop thinking about you. The boy who becomes protective, attentive, emotionally intense. And Rodney was all of those things. Friends noticed how inseparable they became. At school events, football games, weekend gatherings, Rodney was always near her. He looked at Morgan like she was the most important person in the room. And when you're 14 years old, that kind of attention can feel magical. Especially because Morgan was, by all accounts, deeply compassionate and emotionally loyal. She wasn't someone who played games with people. When she loved someone, she committed fully. And Rodney seemed to love her just as deeply. Years later, even Rodney's own mother would reflect on how devoted he appeared during those early years. He called Morgan Princess. He talked about her constantly. He wanted family members to see how much he adored her. From the outside, they looked like high school sweethearts growing naturally into adulthood together. The kind of couple people root for. The kind people assume will last forever. But there's something important investigators, psychologists, and survivors often say about abusive relationships. The beginning is usually beautiful. If it wasn't, victims would leave immediately. The danger is that the affection is real enough to create emotional dependency before the control begins. And for Morgan, those early years built a foundation so deep that later, when things change, she would spend years trying to get back to the version of Rodney she first fell in love with. That's one of the cruelest parts of psychological abuse. Victims often aren't chasing the present version of the abuser. They're chasing the memory of who that person used to be, or who they believe they were. As Morgan and Rodney got older, their lives became more intertwined. They spent nearly all their formative years together. By the time friends were leaving for college, starting careers, or moving into adulthood, Morgan and Rodney already felt emotionally married. Their identities had fused together slowly over time. And because the relationship started so young, many of the warning signs that might alarm an older adult simply felt normal to Morgan. Rodney wanting to know where she was all the time, that felt protective. His jealousy, proof that he cared. His emotional dependence on her, evidence of love. And that's the terrifying thing about relationships that begin during adolescence. Sometimes a person grows up inside the control before they realize it's control. To outsiders, Rodney's intensity looked romantic, but intensity and stability are not the same thing. Possession and love are not the same thing. At the time, though, nobody saw danger. Not Morgan, not friends, not family, because the relationship still looked happy. Photos from those years show smiling faces, holidays together, family trips, ordinary moments frozen in time. Looking back at them now feels unsettling, because hindsight changes everything. You start searching expressions, body language, tiny moments that might reveal what nobody understood yet. But back then, they were simply young and in love, or at least that's what everyone believed. By 2009, marriage felt inevitable. Morgan was 21 years old. Rodney was 24, young enough to still believe love alone could carry people through anything. The wedding itself looked almost storybook perfect in photographs. White dress, dancing relatives, smiling parents, friends celebrating around them. Two people standing at the center of a room, convinced they were beginning a beautiful future together. Morgan later described the wedding as everything she had dreamed about, and in many ways, it probably was, because abusive relationships are rarely abusive every second of every day. There are real moments of happiness mixed into the fear, real affection, real laughter, real memories. That complexity is exactly what traps victims emotionally. People on the outside often imagine abusive relationships as constant misery, but the reality is usually far more psychologically confusing than that. There are cycles, good periods, tender moments, hope, and hope can become its own prison, especially when you've invested years of your life into someone, especially when you built your entire future around them, especially when the person hurting you is also the person comforting you afterward. To everyone watching from a distance, Morgan and Rodney look like the ideal young couple starting their lives together. Beautiful home, young marriage, plans for children, a future unfolding exactly the way it was supposed to. But appearances can become cages. And sometimes the most dangerous relationships don't begin with obvious violence. Sometimes they begin with overwhelming devotion that slowly transforms into emotional ownership. The shift is often so gradual the victim doesn't notice it happening in real time. A little more control, a little more jealousy, a little more emotional dependence, a little more guilt, until one day, the relationship no longer feels like two people building a life together. It feels like one person slowly disappearing inside another person's needs. But in those early years, Morgan still believed she had found forever. She believed the intensity meant safety. She believed the devotion meant security. She believed the boy who loved her so fiercely would always protect her. And that belief would make what happened later even more devastating, because the person who eventually terrified her most was the same person who once made her feel the most loved. In the beginning, their marriage still looked hopeful. Young couples everywhere struggle financially, argue occasionally, and try to figure out adulthood together. Nothing about Morgan and Rodney's lives immediately stood out as unusual. If anything, people around them probably saw exactly what they expected to see: two young newlyweds trying to build a future. But tragedy has a way of accelerating whatever already exists beneath the surface of a relationship. And only months after the wedding, tragedy arrived at the Metser family's front door. Kevin Metser, Rodney's younger brother, was diagnosed with leukemia. He was only 19 years old. At 19, people are supposed to be planning futures. College, relationships, careers, road trips with friends, late-night conversations about life that still feels endless. Not chemotherapy, not hospitals, not mortality. The diagnosis devastated the family. But according to people close to Rodney, the illness hit him especially hard. Kevin wasn't just his younger brother. He was someone Rodney felt deeply protective of, deeply connected to. Family members would later describe how close they were growing up, and suddenly, Rodney was forced to watch someone he loved slowly disappear in front of him. Hospitals became part of everyday life. Phone calls carried dread. Every small improvement sparked hope. Every setback crushed it again. Families experiencing terminal illness often described living in emotional limbo, trapped between fighting for survival and preparing for loss at the same time. And for young couples like Morgan and Rodney, there was no emotional roadmap for something like this. No life experience. No real understanding yet of how grief can alter people. Morgan tried to support Rodney through it all. She stood beside him at the hospital, sat through difficult conversations, watched the emotional exhaustion take hold of the family. And somewhere during that time, the dynamic inside the marriage quietly began to shift. Because grief doesn't only create sadness. Sometimes it creates dependency. Sometimes it creates fear. And sometimes it exposes emotional instability that had always existed beneath the surface. Eventually, Kevin lost his battle with leukemia. He died at 19 years old. And after the funeral ended, after the casserole stopped arriving at the house, after relatives slowly returned to their own lives, the real grief began. That's the stage people rarely talk about. The silence afterward. The emptiness after sympathy fades. The moment the grieving family realizes the world kept moving while theirs stopped. According to Rodney's mother, something inside Rodney changed permanently after Kevin died. He became emotionally consumed by the loss, withdrawn at times, overwhelmed by others, and increasingly dependent on Morgan in ways that went beyond ordinary marriage. Morgan stopped becoming simply his wife. She became emotional oxygen, the person responsible for stabilizing him, comforting him, keeping him functional. And while that might sound romantic on the outside, psychologists often point out something important. When one partner becomes entirely responsible for another person's emotional survival, the relationship can quietly become dangerous because dependency easily transforms into control, and control is often rooted in fear of abandonment. Morgan likely didn't recognize that shift in real time. She was grieving, too. Kevin had become part of her family as well. She had watched his suffering firsthand. She had watched Rodney collapse emotionally under the weight of losing his brother. And like many compassionate people, Morgan responded to grief by giving more of herself away. More support, more patience, more emotional energy. She tried to hold the relationship together while both of them were falling apart. Then came another pregnancy. For a moment, hope returned. The couple decided to name the baby Kevin in honor of Rodney's late brother. It wasn't just a name. It was an emotional symbol, a way of preserving someone they had lost, a way of carrying love forward instead of leaving it buried in grief. But fate dealt another devastating blow. The baby was born prematurely with a severe congenital heart defect. And suddenly Morgan and Rodney found themselves back inside hospitals again, back inside fear, back inside uncertainty. Except this time, it wasn't Rodney's brother lying in a hospital bed. It was their son. Parents who experience neonatal loss often describe the trauma as impossible to explain fully. There's a unique helplessness in watching a newborn fight for life before they've even had the chance to truly live. Tiny hospital blankets, machines beeping through the night. Doctors explain complicated medical realities while exhausted parents cling desperately to hope. And somewhere in the middle of all that fear, Morgan and Rodney were still just two very young people emotionally unequipped for the magnitude of what was happening around them. Baby Kevin survived only 18 days. 18 days. That's all. Not enough time for first memories. Not enough time for normal routines. Just enough time for attachment to become permanent before everything shattered again. Imagine the emotional atmosphere inside that home afterward. A dead brother, a dying newborn, two major losses almost back-to-back, and two grieving young parents trying desperately to survive emotionally while still pretending life would somehow continue normally. Morgan would later describe that period as emotionally blurred, not because it wasn't important, but because the pain was too overwhelming to process cleanly at the time. Trauma often works like that. Memories become fragmented. Time becomes distorted. Days blend. People survive moment to moment instead of truly living. And during periods of intense grief, relationships either grow stronger together or begin quietly breaking apart underneath the pressure. For Morgan, survival became about endurance, pushing forward, holding things together, try to create stability despite unimaginable emotional exhaustion. But for Rodney, the grief appeared to evolve differently. People close to the situation later suggested he never truly recovered emotionally from losing Kevin. And after the death of their newborn son, whatever emotional foundation had once stabilized him seemed to deteriorate even further. Loss became part of his identity. And unresolved grief can sometimes harden into resentment, emotional volatility, or psychological instability when left untreated. Still, life continued moving forward because life always does. Bills still arrived. Responsibilities still existed. Morning still came after sleepless nights. And eventually, Morgan became pregnant again. In 2012, she gave birth to healthy twins, a boy and a girl. For the first time in years, the house felt alive again. There was noise, movement, laughter, late-night feedings, children crying from separate rooms, tiny socks on the floor, family photos, birthday plans, hope. The twins became the center of Morgan's universe almost immediately. Friends would later describe her as deeply devoted to motherhood. Everything became about creating safety and stability for her children. She poured herself into raising them, protecting them, and building the kind of home she wanted them to grow up in. And motherhood seemed to awaken something stronger inside Morgan, a new sense of purpose, a new resilience, a reason to keep going, no matter how emotionally exhausted she felt. But while Morgan was becoming stronger through responsibility, Rodney appeared to be unraveling beneath it, because children don't just bring joy into struggling relationships. They also expose cracks. Financial stress increases. Emotional pressure intensifies. Sleep disappears. Unresolved emotional issues often become impossible to hide. To outsiders, Morgan and Rodney still look like a young family rebuilding after tragedy. But privately, the emotional imbalance inside the marriage was growing heavier. Morgan kept moving forward. Rodney seemed emotionally trapped in everything they had lost. And somewhere during those years, grief stopped being the only thing haunting that marriage. Control slowly entered the picture. Then anger. Then fear. And by the time Morgan fully realized how much her marriage had changed, she was already deeply trapped inside it. Abusive relationships rarely begin with obvious violence. They begin with shifts. Tiny ones. Easy to excuse. Easy to misunderstand. A sharper tone during an argument. A jealous comment disguised as concern. A demand framed as love. A moment that feels wrong, but not wrong enough to leave over. And by the time the abuse becomes undeniable, the victim is often already emotionally trapped inside a relationship they've spent years trying to protect. For Morgan Metser, the years after the twins were born marked the beginning of that transformation. From the outside, life looked almost ideal. Young family, beautiful children, a home filled with toys, routines, birthday parties, school schedules, and family photos. But behind closed doors, pressure was building quietly. And pressure has a way of exposing what people truly are. After years of emotional upheaval and grief, Morgan began rebuilding herself through work. She launched an interior design business called Shiplap and Sugar, and unlike many small businesses that struggled to gain traction early, hers took off quickly. Clients responded to her creativity immediately. Word spread. Project expanded. The business became more than income. It became an identity, purpose, confidence. For the first time in years, Morgan was building something that belonged to her. Friends later described seeing pieces of her personality return during this period. The exhausted young woman, weighed down by grief and emotional caretaking, slowly began rediscovering herself through motherhood and work. But while Morgan was growing stronger, Rodney Metser was becoming increasingly unstable. He struggled professionally. He lost jobs, jumped between different career paths, tried day trading and other financial ventures that failed to provide long-term stability. And as Morgan's confidence increased, Rodney's appeared to collapse further. That imbalance became emotionally dangerous because controlling personalities often experience a partner's independence as personal rejection, especially when their own life feels out of control. At first, the changes in Rodney may not have looked alarming, not individually. Mood swings, irritability, jealousy, neediness, moments of anger followed by apologies. But abuse usually escalates gradually because gradual escalation is easier to normalize. A controlling partner rarely reveals everything at once. Instead, they slowly redefine what the victim accepts as normal. And Morgan had already spent most of her life emotionally attached to Rodney. She knew his grief, his vulnerabilities, his losses. She understood the emotional pain behind many of his behaviors, which made it easier to excuse them, harder to recognize danger clearly. Friends later noticed Rodney becoming increasingly possessive of Morgan's attention and time. Her growing success may have intensified insecurities that already existed beneath the surface. Morgan was becoming financially independent, socially connected, professionally respected, and people trapped in cycles of control often fear independence more than conflict, because independence threatens their access to emotional power. Then came the violence. One of the earliest major physical incidents reportedly happened during a Labor Day weekend trip to a cabin with friends. It began as an argument, like many abusive incidents do. Nothing dramatic from the outside at first, just tension, raised voices, emotional escalation. Then Rodney attacked her. The details mattered later because this wasn't a mutual altercation. It wasn't simply a bad fight. According to Morgan, Rodney beat her. And afterward, she called her father to come get her. That moment says a lot, because people do not usually call family members for rescue unless fear has crossed a line internally. But what happened afterward is equally important. She stayed, and people unfamiliar with abusive dynamics often misunderstand that part. They ask the wrong question. If it was that bad, why didn't she leave? But trauma bonds do not function logically, especially when abuse exists alongside affection. After violent incidents, abusers frequently become deeply apologetic, emotional, affectionate. They cry, promise change, blame stress, blame grief, blame alcohol, blame misunderstandings. And because victims remember the loving version of the person, too, they desperately want to believe the violence was temporary, an exception, not the truth. The same person terrifying you becomes the same person holding you afterward, saying they're sorry. That contradiction creates psychological confusion powerful enough to trap people for years. And over time, according to Morgan, the abuse expanded far beyond physical violence. There was emotional abuse, psychological manipulation, sexual abuse, coercive control, gaslighting. And gaslighting is one of the most psychologically destructive forms of abuse because it attacks the victim's trust in their own perception of reality. According to Morgan, Rodney allegedly began reframing violent incidents in ways that made her appear unstable. If she was bruised, he claimed he had only been restraining her. If arguments escalated, he described her as irrational or emotionally volatile. If she reacted emotionally after abuse, he used the reaction as evidence that she was crazy. This is a common tactic in coercive relationships. The abuser creates emotional chaos, then points to the victim's distress as proof the victim is a problem. Over time, Morgan said she began questioning herself, not because she was irrational, but because psychological manipulation is repeated consistently over the years, can slowly erode a person's confidence in their own memory. Imagine living inside a reality where every painful experience is constantly rewritten for you. You remember fear. You remember injuries. You remember humiliation. But the person closest to you insists your version isn't real. Eventually, many victims stop trusting themselves altogether. That's what makes gaslighting so dangerous. It isolates people inside their own uncertainty. Morgan later admitted there were moments she genuinely questioned her own judgment and memory. Moments she wondered whether she was overreacting, whether she was somehow responsible for the conflict, whether she really was emotionally unstable the way Rodney claimed. And once that psychological confusion takes hold, leaving becomes dramatically harder, because now the victim no longer trusts their own instincts enough to act decisively. Meanwhile, Rodney allegedly expanded the manipulation beyond Morgan herself. At times, he reportedly involved the children emotionally, making comments that shifted blame toward Morgan, creating narratives where he appeared calm and victimized while she appeared unstable or angry. That tactic is especially devastating because it weaponizes motherhood against the victim. And for Morgan, motherhood was everything. The twins had become her reason for surviving difficult years. Protecting them mattered more to her than protecting herself, which meant emotional threats involving the children carried enormous power. People outside abusive relationships often imagine victims constantly living in terror every second of the day, but the reality is usually more psychologically complicated. There are still family dinners, still holidays, still ordinary moments, still laughing sometimes, still memories that look normal in photographs. That's part of what makes abusive relationships so hard for outsiders to understand. The abuse coexists with normalcy, and victims often cling desperately to the good moments because the good moments feel like proof that the relationship can still be saved. Morgan likely spent years trying to reach the version of Rodney she first fell in love with as a teenager. The attentive boy, the protective boyfriend, the young husband who once made her feel adored. But by this point, the relationship had changed fundamentally. Control had replaced security. Fear had replaced stability. And Morgan was beginning to realize something terrifying. The person she trusted most had become the person causing the most serious emotional damage in her life. Still, even then, leaving wasn't simple, because abusive relationships don't just trap people emotionally. They trap them psychologically, financially, socially, and spiritually, especially when children are involved. Especially when years of manipulation have convinced a victim that they may not survive independently, but quietly, beneath all the fear and confusion, something inside Morgan was beginning to wake up. Not confident yet, not freedom yet, but instinct, the small internal voice telling her something was deeply wrong. The same instinct that years later would save her life on a freezing back porch in the middle of the night. By 2020, something inside Morgan Metser had begun to change. Maybe it was motherhood. Maybe it was emotional exhaustion after years of carrying everyone else's pain. Maybe it was a quiet realization that love should not feel like fear. Or maybe it was survival instinct finally becoming louder than denial. Whatever it was, the shift mattered. Because after years of emotional control, psychological manipulation, and escalating abuse, Morgan did something incredibly dangerous. She decided to leave. To outsiders, divorce paperwork looks cold and procedural. A signature, a court date, custody arrangements, property discussions, legal terminology. But for abuse victims, leaving is rarely just administrative. Emotionally, it can feel like trying to escape a building while someone inside is still pulling you back. And statistically, experts consistently warn that separation is often the most dangerous stage of an abusive relationship, not because the abuse suddenly begins there, but because control is being threatened there. For years, Rodney Metser had existed at the center of Morgan's emotional reality. Even during the worst moments, he still maintained access to her life, her attention, her emotions, her routines. Divorce changed that. Divorce meant boundaries, distance, loss of control. And for controlling personalities, that loss can feel intolerable. But before the danger escalated fully, something remarkable happened. Morgan began coming back to life. Friends noticed it almost immediately, especially her best friend, Nicole. Nicole would later describe seeing pieces of Morgan reappear after the separation, parts of her personality that had slowly disappeared over years of emotional abuse. The difference wasn't dramatic at first. It was subtle. Morgan laughed more naturally. She seemed lighter, more confident, more emotionally present. There's something heartbreaking about that reality, because many survivors don't realize how heavily they've been psychologically carrying fear until they finally step outside of it. It's like emerging from a room with toxic air, and only then realizing how hard it had been to breathe. Morgan started rebuilding her life around stability instead of survival. Her business continued growing. Her children remained her center. And emotionally, she slowly began imagining a future that belonged entirely to her for the first time in years. Not a future built around managing Rodney's moods. Not a future built around avoiding conflict. Her future. That psychological shift matters deeply in abusive relationships. Because once a victim begins imagining life outside the control, the abuser often senses it immediately. And according to people close to the situation, Rodney did. The divorce became official in December 2020. On paper, it was over, legally finalized. Morgan had done what society often tells abuse victims to do: leave, create distance, start over. But real life is rarely that simple, especially when children are involved, especially when years of emotional dependency still linger beneath the surface, and especially when the abusive partner refuses to emotionally accept the end of the relationship. For Rodney, the divorce did not feel like closure. It felt like humiliation. That distinction becomes critically important later, because rejection can trigger something dangerous in controlling personalities, especially people whose identity becomes emotionally fused with the relationship itself. Morgan wasn't just leaving him emotionally. In Rodney's mind, she may have represented stability, validation, identity, purpose, and control all disappearing at once. And instead of processing that loss in healthy ways, he began trying desperately to regain access to her life. The messages came constantly: texts, calls, promises, begging, apologies, declarations of love. At times, he sounded remorseful. At other times, desperate. He promised he would change. Promised he would become financially successful. Promised Morgan would never have to struggle again. Promised he would become the husband she deserved. And this is where many people misunderstand abusive relationships. They imagine victims simply cutting emotional ties instantly once separation happens. But trauma bonds don't dissolve overnight, especially after years together, especially after children, especially after building an entire adult life around another person. Morgan wasn't dealing with a stranger. She was dealing with someone she had loved since she was 14 years old, someone connected to nearly every chapter of her life. And even after abuse, empathy often survives. That's part of what makes compassionate people vulnerable to manipulation. Morgan continued trying to maintain boundaries. She kept emotional distance, focused on the children, focused on work, focused on rebuilding herself. And for a while, it seemed like maybe she was finally moving toward freedom. Then came the phone call that changed everything. Rodney claimed he had pancreatic cancer. The diagnosis immediately shifted the emotional terrain between them, because pancreatic cancer carries terrifying associations. It's aggressive, often fatal. The kind of diagnosis that instantly changes how people view time, conflict, and relationships. And Rodney knew that. He described symptoms, spoke about treatments, sounded emotionally devastated. Then came documents, medical paperwork, diagnosis letters, bills, evidence that appeared convincing enough to erase doubt. And suddenly, Morgan found herself trapped in an impossible emotional position, because this wasn't just her ex-husband. This was still the father of her children, a man she had spent most of her life with, a grieving person supposedly facing death. And Morgan, by nearly every account from people who knew her, was deeply compassionate. That compassion had already kept her inside an abusive relationship longer than she should have stayed. Now it became the doorway Rodney used to re-enter her life. Morgan responded the way many empathetic people would respond. She softened, not romantically. Humanly, there's an important difference. She didn't suddenly forget the abuse, but she also couldn't emotionally ignore someone claiming to be terminally ill, especially someone connected to her children, especially after the losses they had already survived together. And psychologically, Rodney understood that about her better than anyone. That's what makes this part of the story so chilling later. The manipulation wasn't random. It was tailored specifically to Morgan's emotional instincts. Rodney didn't pretend to be powerful. He didn't pretend to be wealthy. He pretended to be dying, because he understood compassion was the one thing Morgan could never completely shut off. Eventually, she allowed him temporary access back into her home while he supposedly recovered. And for a brief period, The emotional boundaries she had fought so hard to build became blurred again. She sat with him, talked with him, tried to support him through what she believed was a life-threatening illness. Meanwhile, according to investigators later, Rodney may have been doing something far darker behind the scenes. Because while Morgan believed she was helping a dying man, investigators eventually concluded Rodney was likely using that opportunity to prepare for the attack that would come weeks later. Authorities later believed he had manipulated the basement window alarm sensor during those visits, creating a future entry point into the home. That detail changes everything emotionally, because it means Morgan's compassion may have been weaponized against her in real time. The kindness she extended became part of the setup. And perhaps most disturbing of all, the entire cancer diagnosis was fake. No pancreatic cancer, no treatment, no illness. The medical documents had allegedly been fabricated. The diagnosis letters were engineered. The emails were falsified. Investigators later discovered Rodney had researched medical paperwork and created a fictional illness elaborate enough to appear believable. Think about the level of calculation involved in that. This wasn't impulsive deception. It was emotional engineering, a carefully constructed narrative designed specifically to bypass Morgan's defenses by targeting the most compassionate parts of her personality. And for a while, it worked. But eventually, inconsistencies began surfacing. Morgan started questioning why Rodney refused to tell family members about the diagnosis. Why did details keep feeling vague? Why didn't things fully add up? And slowly, the emotional fog began lifting again. She pushed him to leave, tried once more to restore boundaries, tried once more to reclaim distance. But by then, something far more dangerous had already begun forming inside Rodney, because when manipulation stopped restoring control, he started moving toward something else entirely, something violent, something planned. Something that would turn the first night of a new year into a nightmare Morgan would never forget. When investigators later looked back over the timeline of the case, there was one part that disturbed many of them almost as much as the attack itself. Not because it was violent, but because it was calculated, cold, patient, emotionally precise. The fake cancer diagnosis revealed something terrifying about Rodney Metser. This was not someone acting purely out of rage in a single emotional moment. This was someone capable of studying another person's emotional vulnerabilities and weaponizing them. By late 2020, Morgan Metser had begun emotionally separating herself from Rodney in ways she hadn't before. The divorce was either approaching finalization or already emotionally inevitable. She was rebuilding, creating distance, setting boundaries, and for perhaps the first time in years, those boundaries were beginning to hold. That terrified Rodney, because emotional control was slipping away. And according to investigators, he responded by constructing an entirely new strategy. If guilt wouldn't work, if promises wouldn't work, if emotional pressure wouldn't work, then he would become someone Morgan couldn't morally abandon. A dying man. The phone call changed everything emotionally. Rodney told Morgan he had pancreatic cancer. The diagnosis immediately carried weight because pancreatic cancer is widely understood as one of the deadliest forms of cancer. It's aggressive, difficult to treat, often fatal. People hear those words and instantly think terminal. Rodney described symptoms in detail: pain, medical concerns, treatments, appointments. He sounded believable because he had done research. And then came the paperwork, emails, diagnosis letters, medical documentation, bills, evidence that appeared legitimate enough to bypass suspicion. That detail matters because some people later questioned how Morgan could believe something so elaborate. But deception becomes easier when the liar already understands your emotional psychology. And Rodney knew Morgan intimately. He knew she was compassionate. He knew she was nurturing. He knew she carried guilt easily. He knew she would never ignore someone she believed was dying, especially the father of her children, especially after all the losses they had already survived together. And that's what makes this chapter so psychologically disturbing. Rodney didn't create a lie designed to intimidate Morgan. He created a lie designed to activate her empathy. There's a major difference. He wasn't trying to scare her back into the relationship yet. He was trying to emotionally bypass her boundaries. And for a while, it worked. Morgan softened toward him, not because she wanted reconciliation, but because she believed another human being was suffering. And by nearly every account from people who knew her, compassion was deeply embedded in Morgan's personality. Even after everything she had experienced in the marriage, she still responded to pain with care. That's why abuse survivors are often misunderstood. People imagine victims eventually becoming emotionally hardened toward their abusers. But many survivors remain empathetic long after the relationship ends, especially when children connect them permanently. This was still the father of her twins. Still, someone she had once built a life with. Still, someone she had mourned losses beside. And now, according to him, he was dying. So Morgan allowed Rodney temporary access back into her home while he recovered. And that decision would later haunt the investigation. During those visits, investigators concluded Rodney was likely doing far more than recovering. Authorities later believed he had manipulated the basement window alarm sensor during his time inside the house. A tiny detail at the time, easy to overlook, but critically important later, because investigators came to believe that while Morgan was caring for him, Rodney was quietly preparing an undetected future entry point into the home. Think about the emotional contrast in that image. Morgan believed she was helping someone vulnerable. Meanwhile, investigators believed Rodney was preparing for violence. That's one of the darkest realities in coercive abuse cases. Kindness itself becomes exploitable. Empathy becomes vulnerability. And the victim's humanity gets used against them. During this period, Rodney reportedly continued leaning heavily into the role of the suffering man trying to hold himself together. And emotionally, that role carried enormous power over Morgan because it echoed years of shared grief between them. This was a couple who had buried a child together, who had mourned Rodney's brother together, who had survived devastating emotional losses side by side. So when Rodney presented himself as sick and vulnerable, it triggered old emotional instincts in Morgan automatically. Protect, support, help. That's what compassionate people do. But eventually, small inconsistencies began surfacing. Not dramatic ones at first, just enough to create unease. Morgan encouraged Rodney to tell family members about the diagnosis. That request should have been normal. A terminal illness usually pulls families together. But Rodney resisted, strongly, and that resistance raised alarms for Morgan. Why keep something this serious a secret? Why avoid involving relatives? Why keep conversations controlled so tightly? The more she paid attention, the more the story began feeling emotionally off. And after years of manipulation, that growing instinct mattered enormously. Because Morgan was slowly relearning how to trust herself again, that instinct eventually pushed her to create distance once more. She asked Rodney to leave, reestablish boundaries, tried to step back out of the emotional fog. But by then, according to investigators, Rodney's manipulation had already escalated into planning. What authorities uncovered later was chilling. There was no pancreatic cancer, no diagnosis, no illness. The documents were fake. The emails were fabricated. The medical narrative was entirely invented. Investigators later discovered Rodney had researched medical paperwork and methods for creating believable cancer documentation specifically to support the deception. That detail fundamentally changed how people viewed the case. Because fake illnesses and abusive relationships are not always about sympathy alone. Sometimes they are about regaining emotional access after control is lost. And Rodney's alleged strategy revealed a frightening level of psychological understanding. He didn't pretend to become stronger. He pretended to become weaker. Because weakness would trigger Morgan's compassion more effectively than dominance ever could. That's what makes the manipulation so disturbing. He understood exactly who Morgan was emotionally. He understood the parts of her personality most likely to override fear and boundaries. And he used them. Investigators later viewed the fake cancer diagnosis as one of the clearest indicators of premeditation in the entire case. Not because pretending to be sick is illegal by itself, but it demonstrated planning, research, intentional deception, strategic emotional manipulation. This wasn't a man spiraling randomly after divorce. This was someone constructing scenarios designed to regain proximity and emotional influence over his former partner. And perhaps the most tragic part is this. Morgan's compassion was genuine. Her care was genuine. Her concern was genuine. She responded humanely to someone she believed was suffering. But according to investigators, Rodney saw T compassion not as kindness, but as an opportunity. And when compassion eventually stopped restoring the control he wanted, the manipulation evolved again. Because for some controlling people, emotional access becomes addictive. And once they realize they can no longer emotionally possess the other person willingly, they may attempt to regain control through fear. That shift was already happening beneath the surface, quietly, dangerously. And by the time Morgan fully realized the cancer story was false, Rodney had already started preparing for something far more terrifying than deception. December 31st, 2020, the final night of the year that had already exhausted almost everyone. Across the country, people were trying to celebrate the end of chaos. Families gathered around televisions, counting down to midnight. Fireworks waited to explode over quiet neighborhoods. Restaurants closed late. Music echoed through homes. And inside her Georgia house, Morgan Metser was trying, perhaps for the first time in a very long time, to feel peace. Earlier that evening, she had spent time with her best friend Nicole. That detail matters because trauma survivors often cling tightly to ordinary moments. Conversations, laughter, time with trusted people. Those moments become emotional anchors during periods when life feels unstable. Nicole had become one of Morgan's strongest emotional supports during the separation from Rodney Metser. She was someone who saw Morgan clearly at a time when Morgan herself was still learning how to trust her own reality again. The twins were away in Florida with Morgan's sister. Safe, happy, far from the emotional tension that had consumed so much of the household over the years. And when Morgan finally returned home that night, the house felt unusually still. No children running through hallways. No television noise. No emotional chaos. Just silence. For many people, silence feels lonely, but for someone emerging from years of emotional abuse, silence can feel sacred. And according to people close to her, Morgan wanted exactly that night. Rest, stillness, a break from emotional pressure. Meanwhile, Rodney was unraveling. Throughout the day, he flooded Morgan with messages, texts filled with desperation, promises about the future, plans for changing his life, promises to earn more money, promises to become successful, promises that she would never have to struggle again if she gave him another chance. Emotionally, the messages carried the familiar rhythm of coercive relationships, panic disguised as devotion. The more distance Morgan created, the more intensely Rodney appeared to push for emotional access. And then came one of the strangest moments of the entire case. At some point that day, Rodney slipped a check for more than $56,000 beneath Morgan's porch and texted her a photograph of it. $56,000. Enough money to immediately grab attention. Enough money to create emotional confusion. Enough money to symbolize rescue, stability, and security. But investigators later discovered something critical. The check would have bounced. Rodney was reportedly struggling financially at the time, which means the gesture was never truly about money. It was a performance, theater, a dramatic emotional act designed to create impact. And psychologically, that detail says a lot about where Rodney's mindset had gone by this point. This was no longer just a man trying to repair a relationship honestly. This was someone constructing emotional scenes, grand gestures, manipulations, narratives, almost like he was trying to force reality into becoming the version he wanted. But Morgan didn't respond the way he hoped. She ignored the gesture, ignored the emotional bait, and sometime before going to sleep, she told Rodney something important. She said she would be staying at her parents' house that night, not at home. Then she turned off her phone. That decision may have saved her life, because investigators later believed Rodney expected the house to be empty at first. And if he had fully known Morgan was home, the attack may have unfolded very differently. That possibility becomes terrifying when you consider what prosecutors later suggested about Rodney's mental state and planning. Sometime after midnight, Morgan woke up, At first, she may not have fully understood what pulled her from sleep. A sound, movement, instinct. Then she saw him, a figure standing inside the bedroom doorway. Dark clothes, mask, gloves, gun. The image itself sounds cinematic now, almost unreal in retrospect. But for Morgan, this was immediate terror. No time to think clearly. No time to process. Just fear. The intruder's voice sounded distorted, artificially deep, almost exaggerated. Morgan later compared it to someone imitating Batman. That detail became incredibly important later because investigators would eventually uncover internet searches connected to changing vocal tone and disguising voices. But in the moment, Morgan didn't know any of that yet. All she knew was that a masked man was standing in her bedroom in the middle of the night, and then he attacked. Fast, violently. He struck her with the gun, tried strangling her. Not once, twice. Those moments matter psychologically because strangulation is one of the strongest predictors of future lethal domestic violence. Experts frequently describe it as an intensely personal form of violence, one rooted not just in physical harm, but in domination and control. Morgan fought to survive while still trying to understand what was happening. Then came the restraints. The attacker used pre-loop zip ties, already prepared in advance. That detail later became critical to investigators because it demonstrated planning. The restraints had not been improvised inside the house. Whoever committed the attack arrived prepared. The attacker demanded Morgan's iPhone and passcode. Again, at the time, that may have sounded like ordinary criminal behavior, but investigators later realized it was far more strategic than that. Morgan's phone controlled the home security system. The cameras, the sensors, the electronic access is connected to parts of the house. Once he had the phone and passcode, the attacker reportedly used a security app to disable systems, unlock access points, and delete surveillance footage before leaving with the phone entirely. The phone was never recovered. That matters because random intruders usually flee quickly. They don't calmly manipulate digital security systems with insider knowledge. They don't understand the home's infrastructure so precisely. Then the attacker dragged Morgan outside, into the freezing January night. Imagine the shock to the body. One moment inside a warm bedroom, the next outside in winter darkness, injured, terrified, restrained. A pillowcase was pulled over her head, and then came the instructions. Cold, precise, terrifying. Do not move until you hear 2 car honks. If you move, you die. That threat trapped Morgan psychologically as much as physically, because now survival depended not only on endurance, but obedience. And for the next 40 minutes, Morgan lay restrained on her own back porch while the world unknowingly celebrated the arrival of a new year. Fireworks cracked somewhere in the distance. Cars occasionally passed. Neighbors remained asleep nearby, completely unaware that a woman was bound and terrified just feet away in the darkness. That contrast makes the scene feel even more haunting. Life continues normally around unimaginable fear. Morgan later described those moments as surreal. Time slowed strangely. Fear distorted everything. Cold seeped into her body, while her mind fought desperately to stay focused. And somewhere during those 40 minutes, something shifted internally, because trauma survivors often describe heightened awareness during moments of extreme danger. The brain starts analyzing details rapidly, searching desperately for patterns that might mean survival. Morgan started replaying moments from the attack. The voice, the movements, the familiarity. Then came one specific memory that changed everything. The way the attacker lifted her. The angle, the grip, the physical familiarity of it. And suddenly, Morgan's body recognized something before her mind fully accepted it. Years earlier, when she was pregnant with the twins, Rodney used to help her stand exactly that way. The realization hit her slowly but unmistakably. This wasn't random. This wasn't a stranger. It was Rodney. And perhaps the most remarkable part of the entire ordeal happened next. Morgan said nothing. She did not confront him, did not react, did not reveal recognition. Because even in that state, injured, terrified, restrained in the freezing dark, she understood something crucial. If Rodney realized she knew it was him, he might kill her. That level of survival instinct is extraordinary. She stayed silent, listened, waited, and eventually, through the darkness and distant sounds of New Year's celebrations, she heard them. 2 car honks, exactly like the attacker had promised. And moments later, another performance was about to begin, because the man who had just terrorized her was about to return, pretending to save her. Trauma survivors often describe moments where instinct becomes sharper than logic, moments where the body recognizes danger before the conscious mind fully catches up. That's what happened to Morgan Metser on the freezing back porch of her own home during the first hour of New Year's Day 2021. She still couldn't see his face. A pillowcase covered her head. Her wrists were restrained. Her body hurt from the beating and attempted strangulation. And yet somewhere inside the chaos, her mind had started assembling pieces. Small details at first, easy to overlook individually, but impossible to ignore together. The attacker had spoken to her strangely, personally. At one point, he told her she would miss her husband, not ex-husband, husband. That distinction lodged itself in Morgan's mind immediately. Why would a stranger say that? Why would a random intruder frame Rodney emotionally that way? It sounded intimate, familiar, possessive, and trauma often heightens awareness toward inconsistencies because survival depends on recognizing patterns quickly. Then came the moment that changed everything. At some point during the attack, the masked intruder lifted Morgan physically, and suddenly her body remembered something her conscious mind hadn't fully processed yet. The grip, the angle, the way he supported her weight. It felt familiar in an almost impossible way. Years earlier, when Morgan had been pregnant with twins, her body had changed dramatically. Standing up became difficult late in the pregnancy, and Rodney used to help her rise from bed or from chairs in a very specific way. People don't usually think about physical memory until moments like this, but the body remembers patterns, movements, pressure, touch, and standing there injured and terrified in the freezing darkness, Morgan realized something horrifying. She recognized the way this man carried her. It was Rodney, not a stranger, not a random criminal, not a home invasion gone wrong. Rodney. That realization must have detonated emotionally inside her, because in an instant, the entire attack changed meaning. Every detail suddenly rearranged itself into something far more terrifying. The familiarity with the house, the focus on her phone and security system, the personal comments. The violence felt emotional instead of random. It all fits. And perhaps the most extraordinary thing Morgan did that night happened next. She stayed silent. She did not accuse him, did not react, did not reveal recognition. Even in that moment of terror, Morgan understood something critical in real time. If Rodney realized she knew it was him, he might kill her. That level of psychological awareness during extreme trauma is remarkable. Most people imagine survival as purely physical, fighting, running, escaping. But sometimes survival is strategic silence. Morgan later explained that she consciously hid the realization from him because she sensed the danger immediately. If the disguise failed, if Rodney lost control of the performance he was creating, the situation could escalate into murder. So instead of confronting him, Morgan did something incredibly difficult. She listened, stayed calm, waited, and for roughly 40 minutes, she remained restrained on the porch while her mind raced through the horrifying truth she had uncovered. Think about the emotional isolation of that moment. No one else knew. No one else could see what she now understood. The father of her children had allegedly orchestrated the entire nightmare. The same man who once called her princess. The same man she met as a teenager. The same man she had buried a child with. The same man she had comforted through fake cancer treatments only weeks earlier. And perhaps most chilling of all, he was still acting. According to investigators, the attack itself may have only been part of the larger plan. The performance wasn't over yet. Then finally, through the cold darkness, Morgan heard them. 2 car honks, exactly as promised. That detail became one of the most psychologically disturbing elements of the case because it suggested choreography, timing, planning. The attack and the rescue were connected. Moments later, a vehicle arrived near the front of the house. Then came a voice, frantic, panicked, calling Morgan's name. Rodney. He rushed toward her, untied her restraints, held her, comforted her, called 911, and from the outside, the scene looked convincing, terrifyingly convincing. Imagine arriving at that scene with no prior context. A traumatized woman was tied up on her back porch. An emotional ex-husband who supposedly arrived just in time to save her. A man appearing protective, concerned, and desperate to help. That's the image Rodney allegedly wanted investigators to see. Not an attacker. Hero. And psychologically, that may be the most revealing part of the entire case. According to prosecutors, later, Rodney didn't simply want to hurt Morgan. He wanted to recreate emotional dependency. He wanted to manufacture terror, then become the person she relied on afterward. The nightmare and the rescue were part of the same emotional script. That's why many investigators later viewed the case as deeply unusual. This wasn't a straightforward revenge attack. It appeared psychologically theatrical, calculated to create emotional need. Rodney allegedly created the danger, so he could become the solution. And for a few moments, before law enforcement started pulling the scene apart, the performance almost worked. But experienced investigators noticed something that immediately felt wrong. When officers arrived, they expected panic from Rodney. Shock, fear, confusion. Instead, some investigators later described him as oddly aggressive and controlling. Sergeant Dakota Livers reportedly noticed Rodney speaking to officers with irritation rather than devastation. At one point, Rodney allegedly told officers to do their job. That reaction stood out instantly, because people discovering loved ones brutalized by strangers usually behave emotionally overwhelmed, not confrontational, not impatient, not controlling. Another responding investigator reportedly observed something else important. Morgan's injuries felt personal. The swollen eye, the attempted strangulation, the restraints, the emotional nature of the violence. This did not immediately resemble a random burglary or opportunistic home invasion. It felt targeted, intimate, and experienced investigators are trained to recognize that distinction quickly. Then came the most important moment of the entire early investigation. Police separated Morgan from Rodney, and the instant she was safely out of his hearing range, Morgan told them the truth. She believed Rodney was the attacker. That moment mattered profoundly to her emotionally, because after years of gaslighting and psychological manipulation, Morgan later said this was one of the first times she felt someone listen to her immediately without dismissing her instincts. Investigators believed her, not eventually, not reluctantly, immediately. And for someone who had spent years questioning her own perception of reality, that validation must have felt overwhelming. Gaslighting doesn't only damage confidence during the relationship. It leaves victims terrified they won't be believed afterward. 2. But this time people listened, and once investigators started examining the evidence, the entire illusion Rodney had allegedly built began collapsing piece by piece. When police first arrived at the home in the early hours of New Year's Day, the scene looked chaotic. A woman was beaten and restrained on her own back porch. An emotional ex-husband claimed he had arrived just in time to save her. A masked intruder, supposedly gone without a trace. At first glance, it could have looked like a terrifying but straightforward home invasion. But experienced investigators know something important about violent crime scenes. People often reveal themselves long before the forensic evidence does. And almost immediately, something about Morgan Metser felt wrong. One of the most important decisions officers made that night was to separate everyone at the scene. That procedure may sound routine, but in cases involving domestic violence or manipulation, separation is critical because victims often cannot speak honestly while their abuser is nearby. Fear changes behavior. Control changes behavior. Years of psychological abuse can condition victims to stay silent automatically. The moment Morgan Metser was finally alone with investigators, the truth came out quietly, almost in a whisper. "I think it was Rodney." That sentence changed the direction of the entire case. And according to later interviews, investigators took her seriously almost immediately. That mattered more to Morgan than many people may realize. because victims who survive long-term gaslighting often become psychologically conditioned to expect disbelief. For years, Morgan had allegedly lived inside a reality where her experiences were constantly reframed, minimized, or denied. She had been made to question her own instincts repeatedly, her own memory, her own perception. So when investigators listened to her without dismissing her fears, it reportedly felt overwhelming, almost unfamiliar. For perhaps the first time in years, someone heard her version of reality and trusted it. Meanwhile, officers on scene were already noticing behavioral inconsistencies in Rodney himself. People react unpredictably during trauma, so investigators never rely solely on demeanor. But certain behaviors still stand out. According to responding officers, Rodney appeared oddly aggressive, controlling, more irritated than emotionally devastated. At one point, he reportedly spoke sharply to investigators and told them to do their job. That reaction immediately raised eyebrows. Most people who discover someone they love beaten and restrained and freezing whether react with confusion, panic, grief, and fear, not impatience, not hostility, not emotional detachment wrapped in irritation. The emotional tone fell off, and experienced investigators noticed those subtleties quickly. Then there were Morgan's injuries. They didn't look random. That distinction became important almost immediately. The violence appeared deeply personal. The attempted strangulation, the blunt force injuries, the restraints, the emotional intensity of the attack. This didn't resemble a rush burglary committed by someone searching for valuables. It felt targeted, intimate, intentional. And once investigators began pulling at the details, the entire performance Rodney allegedly constructed started collapsing faster than he likely anticipated. The first breakthrough came from surveillance footage. Investigators traced the zip ties used during the attack back to a purchase at a Lowe's store made just 36 hours earlier. And there on camera was Rodney, not hidden, not disguised, clearly visible, during a period when many people still wore pandemic masks in public. Rodney's face was fully exposed on surveillance footage as he purchased the exact type of zip ties later used to restrain Morgan. That detail became devastating evidence because it established premeditation. This wasn't an object grabbed impulsively during the crime. The restraints had been purchased in advance, prepared deliberately, and the evidence became even stronger once police searched Rodney's apartment. Inside, investigators reportedly discovered additional zip ties matching those used during the attack. But one detail stood out above everything else. A cut portion from one specific zip tie. To most people, it probably looked insignificant, just a small plastic fragment. But forensic analysis later connected it directly to the restraints found on Morgan's wrists, like matching two pieces of a torn photograph together. That single forensic connection dramatically weakened any possibility of coincidence or alternative explanation. Suddenly, investigators didn't just have suspicion. They had physical evidence connecting Rodney directly to the materials used in the attack. And then came the digital evidence, which was perhaps even more disturbing. Investigators searched Rodney's internet history and uncovered searches that painted a chilling picture of planning and obsession. How to change your voice. How long does it take to choke someone unconscious? How to crack an iPhone password. How to get sympathy from an ex. Searches involving cancer diagnosis documents. Each search by itself might seem strange. Together, they formed a psychological roadmap of the crime. The voice search aligned with Morgan describing the attacker's distorted, Batman-like voice. The strangulation searches aligned with the attack itself. The iPhone searches aligned with the attacker targeting Morgan's phone and security systems specifically. And the searches related to sympathy and cancer documentation connected directly to the elaborate fake illness Rodney had allegedly constructed weeks earlier. That combination transformed the case entirely. This no longer looked like emotional chaos or impulsive violence. It looked rehearsed, engineered, planned step by step. And investigators kept finding more. Inside Rodney's phone and digital files, authorities reportedly uncovered hidden folders containing surveillance-style photographs of Morgan, screenshots of private communications, images documenting her life without her knowledge. The discovery suggested obsessive monitoring behavior, an inability to emotionally release control over Morgan even after the divorce. That detail deeply unsettled investigators because coercive control often continues long after relationships officially end. The relationship may be over legally, but psychologically, the controlling person still believes they possess access to the victim's life. And Rodney's alleged monitoring behavior reflected exactly that dynamic. Investigators began seeing a broader pattern emerge. Surveillance, manipulation, emotional engineering, preparation, control, everything appeared connected. Then, investigators discovered something that almost felt symbolic in hindsight. Inside Rodney's apartment was a book titled 7 Ways to Be Her Hero. Under normal circumstances, the title would sound harmless, maybe even sentimental. But in the context of the investigation, it became deeply unsettling because investigators had already begun developing a disturbing theory about Rodney's motive. This wasn't just revenge, and maybe not even purely attempted murder. They believed Rodney may have wanted something psychologically stranger than that. He wanted Morgan to need him again. That idea changes the emotional interpretation of the entire crime. The attack itself allegedly created terror, helplessness, dependency. Then Rodney arrives dramatically afterward. The rescuer, the protector. The man was comforting her after unimaginable fear. The hero, investigators increasingly believe the attack and the rescue were never separate events. They were part of the same emotional script. Rodney allegedly manufactured the nightmare, so he could become the solution to it. And psychologically, that is one of the most disturbing aspects of the entire case, because it reveals how deeply some controlling individuals connect love with dependency. If Morgan would not voluntarily return emotionally, then fear could force emotional reliance. The stage rescue would restore his importance, his necessity, his role in her life. It wasn't enough for Rodney to simply hurt Morgan. Investigators believed he wanted to reposition himself emotionally at the center of her world again, even if he had to create terror to accomplish it. And by this point, the evidence was becoming overwhelming. The surveillance footage, the forensic zip tie match, the search history, the fake cancer documents, the stalking behavior, the inconsistencies in Rodney's own story. Piece by piece, investigators dismantled the illusion. The heroic ex-husband image collapsed completely, and what remained was something far darker. A man investigators believed had carefully engineered violence against a woman he claimed to love, while planning to stand beside her afterward, pretending to save her from it. For the people closest to Morgan Metser, the truth arrived in pieces, not all at once. First came the shock of the attack itself, then the suspicion surrounding Rodney Metser, then the evidence, the zip ties, the surveillance footage, the fake cancer diagnosis, the searches, the stage rescue. And with every new detail the investigator uncovered, the people who loved Morgan were forced to confront a horrifying realization. The danger had been growing for years, mostly unseen. That's one of the cruelest realities of abusive relationships. From the outside, people usually only see fragments. A tense moment, a strange argument, a bruise was explained away, a forced smile at a family gathering, an uncomfortable silence nobody fully understands. Rarely does anyone outside the relationship see the full picture clearly while it's happening, because abuse survives best in private, quietly, incrementally, especially when the abuser knows how to perform normalcy in public. And by many accounts, Rodney understood performance extremely well. To outsiders, he often appeared emotional, devoted, heartbroken after the divorce. A struggling man devastated by losing his marriage and family. That public image matters because controlling people frequently relies on social perception as part of the manipulation itself. If everyone sees them as loving, then the victim becomes easier to discredit. If the victim eventually speaks out, people hesitate. Are you sure? He seems so nice. He loves you so much. And that hesitation alone can trap victims in silence for years. For Morgan's friends and family, the investigation forced painful reevaluation of countless memories. Conversations that once seemed ordinary suddenly felt ominous in retrospect. Moments they dismissed as stress or marital conflict now looked different through the lens of what investigators uncovered. That realization often creates tremendous guilt for loved ones, because once the truth becomes visible, people instinctively start replaying the past, searching for warning signs. What do we miss? Could we have done more? Should we have recognized the danger sooner? Were there moments she tried to tell us without saying it directly? Those questions haunt families after abusive relationships are exposed, especially when the abuse escalates into violence. But experts repeatedly emphasize something important. Abusers are often highly skilled at compartmentalizing behavior. The terrifying version of themselves shown privately may barely resemble the version presented publicly. And victims themselves frequently protect the image of the relationship, too. Sometimes from shame, sometimes from fear, sometimes because years of gaslighting have made them uncertain of their own reality. Sometimes admitting the truth out loud makes the situation feel emotionally real in a way they are not yet prepared to face. Morgan had reportedly spent years trying to preserve normalcy, protecting the family image, managing chaos privately while still functioning publicly as a mother, business owner, friend, and wife. And like many survivors, she likely minimized part of her own suffering simply to emotionally survive day to day. Because when abuse becomes chronic, people often stop asking themselves, is this acceptable? Instead, they ask, how do I get through today peacefully? That survival mindset changes everything psychologically. For Morgan's loved ones, learning the extent of Rodney's alleged manipulation became especially disturbing. The fake cancer diagnosis alone transformed how many people viewed the situation emotionally. Pretending to be terminally ill to regain access to someone's life requires a level of calculation that feels difficult for most people to comprehend. It wasn't merely dishonest. It was predatory emotional manipulation. And when investigators later concluded Rodney may have used that access to prepare for the attack itself, the deception became even darker. The kindness Morgan extended him, the compassion, the caregiving, all of it may have been exploited strategically. That realization deeply affected the people around her because it exposed how vulnerable empathy can become in abusive relationships. Morgan's loved ones also had to confront another painful truth. She had come frighteningly close to dying, not metaphorically, literally. The attempted strangulation alone made that reality impossible to ignore. Experts consistently warn that non-fatal strangulation is one of the strongest indicators of potential future homicide in domestic violence cases. And for Morgan's family, that knowledge changed the emotional weight of everything. This wasn't just an assault. This was a situation investigators believed could easily have ended in murder. And then there were the twins, the children at the center of the entire emotional tragedy. Too young to fully understand the details of what happened. Too young to process concepts like coercive control, gaslighting, or psychological abuse. But old enough eventually to realize something terrible had nearly happened to their mother. That reality alone is heartbreaking. Because on New Year's night, those children came terrifyingly close to losing the person who anchored their entire world. The person who tucked them into bed, protected them, built routines around them, structured her entire life around their well-being. Had events unfolded slightly differently, their childhood could have become defined by unimaginable loss. And for Morgan herself, survival did not mean the suffering suddenly ended after the attack. In many ways, another battle was just beginning. Surviving trauma physically is not the same as recovering psychologically, especially after years of coercive control, especially after prolonged gaslighting. Especially after discovering the person you once trusted most engineered your terror. The attack shattered more than physical safety. It shattered assumptions about reality itself. Think about the psychological damage involved in that. Morgan had spent years being conditioned to doubt her instincts. Then, during the worst night of her life, those instincts turned out to be completely right. That creates a complicated emotional aftermath. Relief, anger, validation, grief, fear, and often deep mourning for the version of yourself that spent years questioning what your body already knew. Recovery for survivors like Morgan frequently involves rebuilding trust internally before anything else. Trusting memory again, trusting perception again, trusting fear signals again, trusting intuition again. That process can take years. Because gaslighting doesn't just distort reality temporarily. It trains victims to override their own instincts automatically. And perhaps one of the most painful parts of healing is realizing how often your internal alarms have been warning you all along. For Morgan, healing also meant confronting the emotional complexity of loving someone who became dangerous. That part is rarely discussed honestly in public conversations about abuse. People often want victims to feel only hatred once the truth emerges. But human emotions are rarely that simple. Morgan's life with Rodney contained real memories, real history, shared grief, children, years of emotional investment stretching back to adolescence. Untangling those emotional realities after trauma is incredibly difficult because survivors are not just grieving what happened. They are often grieving for who they thought the person was. And somewhere beneath all the evidence, courtroom proceedings, and media coverage, there remained a devastating truth. This story did not begin with violence. It began with a teenage girl believing she had found forever. That's part of what made the truth so painful for everyone around her to finally accept. The danger had not appeared overnight. It had been building slowly behind closed doors while life on the outside continued looking almost normal, until one freezing night finally exposed everything hiding underneath. By the time investigators finished processing the crime scene, one thing had become clear. This case was not falling apart. It was tightening, fast. Every new piece of evidence seemed to reinforce the same horrifying conclusion. The attack against Morgan Metser had not been spontaneous. It had been planned, carefully, methodically, emotionally, and prosecutors believed the man responsible was the same person pretending to rescue her afterward, Rodney Metser. But investigators moved carefully, because emotionally disturbing cases can still collapse in court if evidence is gathered recklessly or too aggressively too early. So instead of immediately charging Rodney with the full scope of the attack, investigators made a strategic decision. Initially, Rodney was arrested on invasion of privacy charges. To the public, that may have seemed minor compared to the violence investigators suspected. But legally, it was smart. The charge brought investigators something incredibly valuable. Time to secure digital evidence before it disappears. Time to preserve forensic material. Time to prevent Rodney from destroying records or coordinating explanations. Time to continue building the larger case carefully and methodically. And as investigators dug deeper, the evidence became overwhelming, not just emotionally compelling, structurally devastating. The case prosecutors assembled contained nearly every category of evidence investigators hope to find in a major violent crime investigation: premeditation, planning, forensic connections, digital searches, behavioral inconsistencies, fabricated documents, surveillance footage, and perhaps most importantly, logic, because sometimes the most damaging evidence in a case is not what someone says. It's what they cannot explain. One of the earliest cracks in Rodney's story appeared almost immediately during questioning. Rodney claimed that before arriving at Morgan's house, a stranger had supposedly approached him and warned him that Morgan was in danger. At first glance, the story sounded dramatic but possible, until investigators compared it against a critical fact. Morgan had specifically told Rodney she would not be home that night. She said she would be staying at her parents' house. So investigators asked the obvious question. If Rodney believed Morgan wasn't home, why did he drive to her house at all? The contradiction was impossible to ignore, because the explanation required too many unlikely coincidences. A random stranger supposedly knew Morgan was home, knew she was in danger, randomly found Rodney specifically, and Rodney immediately rushed her despite believing she wasn't even inside the house. The story made no logical sense. Investigators recognized that almost immediately, and one suspicion centered fully on Rodney, the forensic evidence started painting an even darker picture. The low surveillance footage became one of the prosecution's strongest visual pieces of evidence. There was Rodney purchasing zip ties only 36 hours before the attack. Clear footage, debit card transaction records, timestamps, no disguise, no ambiguity. And those zip ties mattered enormously because they connected directly to the restraints used on Morgan. Inside Rodney's apartment, investigators found additional matching zip ties. But more critically, They discovered a cut fragment from one specific tie. Forensic experts later matched it directly to the restraints recovered from Morgan's wrists. That connection was devastating, because forensic evidence removes emotional debate from a case. Opinions can be challenged. Interpretations can be argued. But physical evidence linking materials from a suspect apartment directly to the crime scene creates a factual bridge that becomes extraordinarily difficult to overcome. Then came the digital trail, and it revealed what prosecutors believed was deliberate preparation. Internet searches uncovered on Rodney's devices included how to change your voice, how long does it take to choke someone unconscious, how to crack an iPhone password, how to get sympathy from an ex, searches involving fake cancer diagnoses, and medical paperwork. Each search aligned disturbingly with specific elements of the crime. Morgan described the attacker using an artificially deepened voice. The attacker attempted strangulation. Morgan's iPhone and security systems became central targets during the attack. And the fake pancreatic cancer diagnosis had already drawn Rodney back into Morgan's life weeks earlier. Taken together, investigators no longer saw isolated incidents. They saw rehearsal, preparation, emotional engineering. The evidence suggested someone thinking ahead, step by step. Then, investigators uncovered evidence of obsessive monitoring behavior. Secret folders containing photographs of Morgan, screenshots of private communications. Images were collected without her knowledge. That evidence became important not only legally but psychologically because it demonstrated continued fixation after the divorce. The relationship had ended legally, but emotionally, Rodney appeared unwilling to release control. And prosecutors increasingly believed the attack itself was connected to that psychological collapse. As the investigation progressed, another disturbing realization emerged. The fake cancer diagnosis may have served two purposes simultaneously. First, emotional access. Second, physical access. Investigators later concluded Rodney likely manipulated the basement window alarm sensor during the period Morgan allowed him to stay at her home while he was supposedly recovering. That detail transformed the fake illness from emotional manipulation into operational planning. The compassion Morgan showed him may have unknowingly helped him prepare the attack itself. By now, prosecutors were building a case that extended far beyond simple assault. They argued this was deliberate, staged violence rooted in coercive control and obsession. And eventually, the evidence became so overwhelming that Rodney chose not to risk a trial. He pleaded guilty to 14 separate charges, including kidnapping, home invasion, first-degree burglary, armed robbery, aggravated assault and battery, false imprisonment, invasion of privacy, sexual battery, family violence offenses, possession of a firearm during the commission of a crime. The guilty plea mattered enormously for several reasons. Legally, it avoided the unpredictability of a jury trial. But emotionally, it spared Morgan from something potentially devastating, having to relive every detail publicly in court while facing Rodney directly. That consideration reportedly mattered deeply to prosecutors. According to later reporting, investigators and prosecutors handled the case with unusual sensitivity toward Morgan's emotional well-being. This is significant because survivors of prolonged abuse often experience courtroom proceedings as a continuation of trauma itself. Cross-examination, public scrutiny, forced recollection, attempts to undermine credibility. The plea deal prevented much of that from happening. Still, sentencing day carried enormous emotional weight. On August 4th, 2021, Rodney appeared before Judge Anthony Baker for sentencing. By then, the illusion had fully collapsed. The devoted ex-husband narrative was gone. What remained was a reality investigators believed they had uncovered. A man who orchestrated terror against the mother of his children while allegedly planning to present himself as a rescuer afterward. The sentence reflected the severity of what prosecutors believed nearly happened that night. 70 years total, 25 years in prison, 45 years on probation afterward, much of the prison term without eligibility for early parole. And perhaps most importantly to Morgan, Rodney was permanently prohibited from contacting her or their children. That final restriction mattered because survivors of coercive control often describe the fear lasting long after convictions. Abuse is not experienced as isolated incidents. It becomes a state of hypervigilance, a feeling that the person may somehow return emotionally, psychologically, or physically at any moment. The no-contact order created legal protection, but the emotional recovery would take far longer. Because even after the case officially ended in court, Morgan still faced a difficult task of rebuilding a life after years spent surviving someone who claimed to love her. And perhaps the most haunting part of the entire case is this. The evidence suggested Rodney didn't simply want to hurt Morgan. Investigators believe he wanted to make her emotionally dependent on him again. He allegedly created the nightmare, so he could arrive pretending to save her from it. A performance built from fear, manipulation, and control. And if investigators had not seen through the act quickly that night, the story might have ended very differently. Courtrooms are strange places for trauma. They are designed for procedure, evidence, timelines, legal arguments. But hidden underneath every document and every charge is something much harder to measure: human survival. And by the time Morgan Metser entered the courtroom for sentencing, she had already survived far more than the public fully understood. Not just the attack. Years of fear, years of manipulation, years of slowly losing trust in her own instincts, years of emotional exhaustion that no photograph could properly capture. So when the time finally came for Morgan to speak directly to Rodney Metser in court, many people likely expected visible emotion: tears, anger, collapse, something dramatic. Instead, Morgan reportedly spoke calmly, steadily, controlled, and in many ways, that composure made her words even more powerful, because survivors do not always look shattered when they tell the truth. Sometimes they sound composed precisely because they already endured the most terrifying part long before they ever enter courtroom. By sentencing day, Morgan had already lived through the nightmare, already lain bound on a freezing porch, believing she might die, already spent years trapped inside psychological warfare, disguised as love, already fought her way back toward reality after prolonged gaslighting. The court was not the hardest thing she had survived, not even close. And there's something important about that moment psychologically. Abusers often rely on emotional chaos to maintain power: fear, confusion, instability. But when survivors finally speak clearly and calmly, it represents something profound: the return of certainty, the return of self-trust, the return of voice. Morgan no longer sounded like someone questioning her own reality. She sounded like someone who finally understood it completely. After sentencing, Morgan later described feeling something lift from her body, a weight she hadn't fully realized she had been carrying for years. That statement resonates deeply with many survivors of coercive control because chronic emotional abuse often becomes physically internalized. The body carries it. Hypervigilance, tension, fear, the constant emotional calculation required to survive unpredictable behavior. People living inside abusive relationships frequently adapt to stress so gradually that they stop recognizing how heavy their psychological burden has become until the danger finally ends. And even then, freedom can feel emotionally unfamiliar at first. Because when someone spends years monitoring another person's moods, reactions, and emotional volatility, the nervous system learns to stay constantly alert. Safety itself can feel strange afterward. Silence can feel suspicious. Peace can feel temporary. So when Morgan described feeling that weight leave her body, she was likely describing something far deeper than relief over a prison sentence. It was a release of prolonged survival mode, the end of the years spent psychologically bracing herself. But Morgan's story did not end in that courtroom. In many ways, another chapter began there, because after surviving the attack and the investigation, Morgan gradually became something she never expected to be: a public voice for other survivors. She began speaking openly about emotional abuse, gaslighting, narcissistic manipulation, coercive control, and perhaps most importantly, the danger victims face after leaving abusive relationships. That final point matters enormously because one of the biggest misconceptions about domestic abuse is a belief that leaving automatically ends a threat. In reality, experts repeatedly warn that the opposite can be true. The period immediately after separation is often the most dangerous phase of the entire relationship, and statistically, that danger is well documented. Domestic violence experts consistently identify post-separation as one of the highest risk periods for lethal escalation, because for controlling individuals, separation does not simply represent heartbreak. It represents loss of access, loss of control, loss of identity, loss of possession. And for some abusers, that loss triggers desperation, escalation, punishment. The violence that once maintained control becomes violence reacting to its disappearance. Morgan's case became a chilling example of exactly that pattern. Her divorce became official only weeks before the attack. That timing was not random. Investigators and prosecutors openly acknowledged that. The legal end of the marriage appears to have intensified Rodney's behavior dramatically. As long as emotional access still existed, he could continue trying to manipulate the relationship. But once the divorce was finalized, reality became unavoidable. Morgan was moving forward without him. She had her children, her business, her friendships, her independence, her future. And according to prosecutors, Rodney could not tolerate losing that control. That distinction matters because cases like this are often misunderstood publicly as crimes driven purely by love or heartbreak. But experts frequently emphasize that coercive abuse is fundamentally about power and control, not love. Love does not require ownership. Love does not punish independence. Love does not create fear to manufacture emotional dependence. What investigators believed Rodney wanted was not a partnership. He wanted necessity. He wanted to remain emotionally central in Morgan's life. And when voluntary emotional connection failed, prosecutors argued he escalated into manipulation, stalking, deception, and violence. The fake cancer diagnosis reflected that desperation clearly. The stage rescue reflected it even more. He allegedly created the terror, so he could become the person rescuing her from it. That psychological dynamic disturbed many investigators because it revealed how deeply intertwined control and identity had become for Rodney. Morgan eventually began using her platform to help explain these patterns publicly because many victims do not recognize coercive control while they are living inside it, especially when the relationship began with intense affection, devotion, protection, charm. That's part of what makes these dynamics so dangerous. The abuse rarely starts with obvious terror. It starts with emotional intensity, mistaken for love, and over time, boundaries slowly disappear while manipulation quietly grows underneath the surface. Morgan's willingness to discuss those realities publicly helped many people recognize patterns in their own lives. The gaslighting, the emotional isolation, the reframing of reality, the gradual erosion of self-trust. Those forms of abuse often leave no visible bruises initially, yet they can psychologically dismantle victims over the years. And one of the strongest messages Morgan continued emphasizing was simple but powerful. Trust your instincts. Because during the worst night of her life, after years of being conditioned to doubt herself, her instincts were the thing that saved her. Not certainty, not evidence. Instinct. The recognition in the way Rodney carried her. The emotional tone of the attack, the familiarity hidden beneath the disguise. Her body recognized the truth before her mind fully accepted it. And instead of ignoring that feeling, she listened to it. Quietly, strategically. Survival often looks less dramatic than people imagine. Sometimes survival is staying calm long enough to make it through the next minute. Sometimes it's recognizing danger before anyone else sees it. Sometimes it's finally believing in yourself after years of being taught not to. And perhaps that's why Morgan's story stayed with so many people afterward. Because underneath the crime itself is something deeply human. A woman slowly rediscovering her own reality after someone spent years trying to take it away from her. She survived the violence. But even more importantly, she survived the psychological destruction designed to make her stop trusting herself. And in the end, the instinct she had once been taught to silence turned out to be right all along. There's something uniquely disturbing about the story of Morgan Metser and Rodney Metser. Not just the violence, not even the fake cancer diagnosis. It's the rescue, because most attackers flee. They disappear into darkness. They avoid the scene. But according to investigators, Rodney's plan was different from the beginning. He intended to come back. That detail changes the emotional meaning of the entire crime. He allegedly planned to terrorize Morgan, then return as the person comforting her afterward, to untie her restraints, to hold her while she cried, to call 911, to stand beside her, looking like a protector, a savior, a hero, and psychologically, that may be the most horrifying part of all, because it reveals something deeply unsettling about coercive control. For some abusers, causing pain is not the final goal. Control is. Emotional dependence is. They need to remain central in the victim's world. Needed, indispensable, necessary. That need can become so psychologically consuming that they will manufacture crises simply to force emotional attachment back into existence. And investigators believe that is exactly what happened here. When Morgan divorced Rodney, she did more than end a marriage. She disrupted the emotional structure that allowed him control over her life. She stopped orbiting around him emotionally. She began rebuilding herself, her own future, her own confidence, her own identity outside the relationship. And according to prosecutors, Rodney could not tolerate that loss of control. The fake cancer diagnosis was an attempt to regain emotional access through sympathy. When sympathy failed, the manipulation escalated into terror. But even the terror itself was allegedly constructed with a purpose beyond violence. Rodney did not simply want Morgan afraid. Investigators believed he wanted her dependent again. He wanted to become the person she ran toward after fear. That is what makes this case feel psychologically different from many other violent crimes. The attack and the rescue were part of the same emotional script. The nightmare was designed so the hero could exist. And perhaps the cruelest irony of all is this. The man trying desperately to become Morgan's hero had become the greatest danger in her life. But the plan failed, not because of luck, not because Rodney changed his mind. It failed because Morgan trusted herself during the moment it mattered most. That truth carries enormous weight when you understand what she had survived psychologically before the attack even happened. For years, Morgan had allegedly been conditioned to doubt herself, her memory, her instincts, her perception of reality. That is what long-term gaslighting does. It slowly teaches victims to distrust their own internal warning systems, to second-guess fear, to override intuition, to ignore discomfort. But on that freezing porch, bound and terrified in the darkness, Morgan listened to herself. The familiarity in the way Rodney lifted her, the emotional language the attacker used, the feeling beneath the disguise. Her instincts recognized the truth before the evidence existed, and instead of dismissing that feeling, she protected it quietly, strategically. That decision may have saved her life, because Morgan understood something terrifying in real time. If Rodney realized she knew it was him, she might never leave that porch alive. So she stayed calm, waited, survived, and eventually told investigators the truth. A truth that evidence would later confirm piece by piece. Today, Morgan continues rebuilding her life, raising her twins, speaking publicly about emotional abuse, gaslighting, narcissistic manipulation, and the dangers victims often face after leaving controlling relationships. Because her story carries an important warning that extends far beyond one single case. Abuse is not always obvious. It does not always begin with violence. Sometimes it begins with devotion, so overwhelming it feels like love. Sometimes it hides inside protection. Inside, jealousy is mistaken for passion. Inside, manipulation disguised as care. And sometimes the most dangerous person in someone's life is the person everyone else believes would protect them. Meanwhile, Rodney remains behind bars at Baldwin State Prison, serving the sentence that followed the collapse of the carefully constructed image he spent years trying to maintain. What began as a teenage love story became a calculated nightmare. A story about invisible abuse, manipulation, control, fear, survival, and the terrifying reality that sometimes the person pretending to save you is the person you needed saving from all along. If this story stayed with you, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications for more deeply researched true crime cases told with the detail, psychology, and humanity these stories deserve. Because behind every headline is a real person, a real family. And sometimes the scariest monsters are the ones hiding in plain sight.